Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this meeting of the Environmental Quality Board's Silica Sand Subcommittee on Wednesday, December 18th. We are missing the EQB chairman. Dave Fredrickson is still traveling, and so he's not able to chair the meeting today. It's my task. We're going to introduce ourselves as a board member, but for some of you this might be a relief. I am not Commissioner Fredrickson, and I'm not going to be passing the microphone through the room to get everyone to introduce themselves, but as Commissioner Fredrickson is often want to do, is just let everybody introduce themselves. We'll just take this agenda because we have a lot to cover today, and we have a lot of people who've asked to be heard, and so I want to get on with the meeting. We have just for the sake of framing expectations, I'll come back to that after we introduce ourselves. My name is John Linkstein. I'm the Commissioner of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and let's start at the other end and introduce ourselves.
Ed Ellinger, Commissioner of Health.
John Saxhaug, I'm a citizen member from the Twin Cities.
I'm Eric Tomlinson. I'm also a citizen member from the Twin Cities. Will Seifert, Director of the EQB.
Tom Landwehr, Commissioner of DNR.
Charlie Zelli, Commissioner of MnDOT.
Brian Napstead, Chairman of the Board of Water and Soil Resources.
Thank you, and also want to thank all the staff from the agencies that have been working hard on the draft model standards and criteria. We'll be hearing from them. For the sake of the conversation this afternoon, if you are interested in speaking to the board today and providing comments, there are forms at the table. We ask you to fill one of those out so we don't miss anyone who wants to be heard. Please fill that out, bring it up to the staff person's desk over here. She had to step out for a second, but if you bring that forward, leave it over there on the corner of the table. We'll make sure that we get you in the queue for testifying and giving us your comments. We think that the presentation by staff of the draft model standards and criteria is going to last somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour, just so that people kind of understand the time frame we're working under. We will wrap up after the staff presentation. Board members, if you have questions of the staff on content of the draft, we can interject those throughout the presentation, but I'd also want us to have a little bit of a conversation after the staff has made their presentation, just on a reaction from board members and a little discussion on that. Then we'll take public comments for the majority of the meeting, and then wrap up with maybe some closing remarks by board members before the end of the meeting, and we adjourn. Our expectation today is just to hear about the draft and to take comments on them. I also wanted to thank Commissioner Brian Napstead from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. I know you're not technically on the committee, but you're joining us today. Thanks for being here. I also understand you might have to leave a little early, so feel free to take leave when that's necessary.
Thank you.
With that, I would ask for us to begin the presentation by the staff. Mr. Smizer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Jeff Smizer. I'm one of the EQB staff. I'm a principal planner with staff, and I do, first of all, want to echo our thanks to the other agency staff, even though the EQB is growing infinitesimally over time with our own staff. Most of our work is dependent upon people from the member agencies, and people really pitched in on this one. So really want to express my appreciation to the people who have been working on it and to the commissioners who have cut them loose to help us. Don't work them too hard just because they're helping us, okay? Okay, talk about a little bit of the background. Everybody in this room knows that the discussion of silica sand, frac sand, has been on many people's agendas for many, many months, even years. As you know, we did have the mandate from the legislature in the 2013 session to address this at EQB. Just a quick review of the main points leading up to the document that we're going to discuss today. We were ordered to develop model standards and criteria for mining, processing, and transporting. We're to consult with local units of government. These model standards, whatever somebody might want to call them, may be used by local units of government in developing local ordinances, and the guidelines, standards, criteria are to be different for the two different areas of the state where it's appropriate. Regarding consulting with local governments, we did send out a survey, got some responses from a good number of them on different items. The document itself does include some of the data from that survey, which is very useful to people working on the document in their respective chapters. The different geographic areas throughout the document where there is a reason to differentiate between a recommendation or a standard or a consideration that is pointed out in the document, where the issues do not differ because there's no difference between, well, put it this way, when the recommendation or the consideration or suggestion applies equally to both, then it applies equally to both. So throughout the document it's pointed out when necessary. So what we came up with to fulfill the requirements of the statute was this document, which was posted online last Friday, December 13th. Yes, I know there's lots of jokes about Friday the 13th, but that's just the way it worked out. We do not possess tridistidecaphobia, right? Is what it's called. And if you do, then you might not want to touch this. There you go. So it was posted on Friday on our website. We did send out notices through GovDelivery that it was available. It can be downloaded from the website. And it also started the public comment period that will go on for 30 days through January 13th. Just want to reiterate, staff from 6 different agencies worked really hard on this document. Staff from the DNR, the PCA, MnDOT, Agriculture, Department of Health, and of course yours truly for the EQB, as well as my colleagues in the EQB. They're the ones who have been sort of picking me up off the floor and throwing water in my face and saying, it's okay, keep going, keep going. Just to try to get summary, just summarizing the document itself, the organization of the document itself. There's an introduction with 5 chapters, as shown on the screen: air quality, and water quantity, transportation, operations, and then setback and buffer considerations. Within each one of those chapters, the general organization is shown there on the screen, description of the concerns that silica sand projects might raise, and then the meat of that particular subsection, really the narrative description and background. Then we typically have a list, sort of a bullet point list summarizing what potential impacts were discussed, just for sort of convenience sake. And then the end of each one would be what we titled recommendations, standards, criteria, considerations. You will not find all 4 of those in each one. We just wanted to have a consistent header for them. Some chapters there are recommendations, some chapters there are suggested standards, some suggest criteria, some list further considerations. It depends on the different topics. Some of them just call for a little bit different approach to things. Clarifications, disclaimers. There is some ongoing misunderstanding about what this document is supposed to be. Different people have different goals for it. I really want to clarify every chance I get that this document is not intending to represent legal advice or legal opinions for anybody. The local government unit we strongly recommend that when adopting or amending their official controls, be it the zoning ordinance or any other ordinance, that they get the appropriate legal counsel from their attorneys. 2 local units of government are not required to adopt any elements of this document. It's very clear in the legislation that local governments may use these in formulating their own visual controls. They are not obligated to do so. It is completely at the local government's discretion. And then the third point is that the EQB and its member agencies are not enforcing or attempting to enforce any elements of this document as if they are truly adopted state rules. We have no authority to say you shall do these things. So those are 3 points that I think I really want to clarify so everybody understands. The process, as I said, the public comment period began on Friday. It will go through January 13th. We would strongly recommend that comments be emailed to us at the email address shown there, silicasand.eqb@state.mn.us. Repeat that little pause up there a little bit for those who are writing it down in the audience. It's also on our website, silicasand.eqb@state.mn.us. Hard copy comments, of course, can be sent to us, sent to me at this address, Environmental Quality Board, 500 Lafayette Road. The thing that's most convenient, most useful about email comments is that we can take them and put them into a larger analysis of the comments coming in, whereas hard copy letters, we can't always do that very easily. So that's why we're preferring that. So unless there are any questions about my little introductory piece from the committee, we can move on, and I'll introduce Jeff Hedman of the PCA, who will be talking about air quality.
Hedman.
Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. My name is Jeff Hedman. I work in the NPCA's air permit section. Today I will present a bird's eye view of the air-related topics that are covered in EQB's draft model standards and criteria. The information in this section is the work of multiple state agencies, including the Department of Health, Natural Resources, Transportation, and PCA. First of these topics concerns air monitoring. The NPCA has an existing ambient monitoring network that collects data for a variety of pollutants, including various size fractions of particulate matter. However, the NPCA's ambient monitor network is primarily designed to gather information on wide geographic areas. Certain facilities within the state have source-oriented or fence line monitors, including refineries, sugar beet plants, and large manufacturing facilities. The pollutant of interest for this industry is called particulate matter, and is divided into several sizes of interest by a parameter called aerodynamic diameter. This parameter is selected as associated with the degree to which the particle can penetrate the human lung. The smaller the particle, the deeper the penetration, and the greater the impact on human health. This industry works primarily with silica sand, which raises additional questions regarding the composition of the particulate matter that is emitted by these facilities. Silica has long been regulated by the federal government through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Mine Safety and Health Administration. These entities regulate within the property boundary of the facility. The US EPA, and by extension the NPCA, regulate what is known as ambient air. This term, ambient air, refers to that portion of the atmosphere external to buildings to which the general public has access. This is generally viewed as the fence line of the facility. At this time, there is very little silica ambient air data. In order to address this lack of data, state and local regulatory bodies have taken action. The Minnesota Department of Health has provided technical guidance in the form of a health-based value regarding chronic exposure to silica in ambient air. The MDH provided this guidance during the summer of 2013. In addition, the NPCA has inserted fence line monitoring requirements into newly issued air permits for silica sand facilities. Some counties, such as Scott County, have coordinated with the NPCA in order to develop monitoring requirements for silica sand facilities within their respective jurisdiction. If a local unit of government is interested in pursuing ambient air monitoring for a silica sand facility, then we encourage the local unit of government to start by reviewing the information we provide within the EQB document. After reviewing it, we strongly recommend that they contact us in order to develop a site-specific air monitoring plan. For informational purposes, we also included rough cost estimates. It is expected that the cost of monitoring will be borne by the facility. The guidance we provide within the EQB document speaks to the type of pollutants that should be monitored, how often to monitor, what types of monitors to use, the frequency at which the monitors collect data, the silica analytical method that should be used, the siting criteria that should be evaluated, and how and to who the data should be reported. After the plan is developed, it will include site-specific conditions, account for local meteorology, reference the equipment and analytical methods that we use to measure particulate matter and crystalline silica concentration, and span a time period covering pre- and post-construction site conditions. The MPCA will host this data on its website. The next air-related topic concerns methods that can be used to control or prevent dust from leaving the silica sand facility. The primary way in which dust leaves the property of the facility is through an interaction with wind. If this interaction is prevented or suppressed, then the particulate matter emissions will be reduced. Therefore, nearly all of the following recommendations stem from this idea. If a local unit of government is interested in using its local permit to limit the degree to which dust leaves the facility, then we encourage the local unit of government to start by reviewing the information within the EQB document. The EQB document describes a dust control strategy that addresses multiple facets of the silica sand process up to and including the transportation of silica sand. We recommend that processing activities be enclosed and that the emissions from these processes be routed to filter-based dust control technologies. We recognize that certain portions of a silica sand facility cannot be enclosed and make recommendations regarding these areas as well. For example, we recommend that mine haul roads be watered at a prescribed rate and suggest some record keeping and testing to ensure that the roads are watered to the degree specified. We make recommendations regarding the transportation of silica sand, including covered loads, a mechanism to wash trucks prior to leaving the facility, fleet composition, and record keeping of vehicles and routes traveled. The third related topic concerns noise. Noise is regulated by the state by time of day and by the location of the person that hears the noise. In general, noise is regulated in a more stringent fashion for nighttime periods and for residential areas. If a local unit of government is interested in evaluating or requiring noise testing, then we recommend that the local unit of government review the information within the EQB document. Within the document, we recommend that every residence within a defined survey needs to check both before and after the construction and operation of the silica sand facility. The survey radius was based on information collected by the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety at numerous mines and dredge facilities. In the event that noise levels exceed state standards, then we recommend the facility raise berm heights, add vegetation, and then perform subsequent testing to ensure standards are met. The final air-related topic concerns accumulation of silica sand within the transportation chain and includes some crossover with water-related issues. If a local unit of government is interested in measures that could be taken to contain the effects of a temporary storage pile, then we encourage the local unit of government to review the information within the EQB document. Silica sand facilities routinely store sand prior to shipping out by a truck, rail, or barge. As was mentioned in the dust control section of the EQB document, we recommend that routine or in-process storage piles be enclosed in order to prevent the material from leaving the site. In the event that supply and demand create a situation where an open-air one-time storage is needed, then this material should be watered at a prescribed rate. The storage pile should be located such that it avoids surface and stormwater conveyances, including curbs, gutters, and ditches. Once the temporary pile has been removed, the area should be vacuum swept as soon as possible. This concludes the overview of the air-related topics. Further information can be found within pages 11 through 31 of the draft model standards and criteria document. Next, my colleague Teresa Haugen will address water-related issues to a greater extent.
Thanks, Mr. Hyman. Any questions from board members before we move on to Teresa's presentation? Just one from me, Jeff. I think I heard you once or more reference a federal or other document from which information on recommended approaches or standards was drawn. Is that common throughout your references on air quality throughout the document? You try to tie it back to a federal air quality standard or a measurement technique, or can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Chair, committee members, that is correct. Where possible, we try to reference existing standards that should be reviewed and enforced, including monitoring methods and analytical methods that have been approved and endorsed by US EPA. We also include references to various studies, which the citations for which should be included within the document.
Thank you. The other question I had was on the cost figures. The document goes into some specific detail on average estimated cost for monitoring equipment. How is that typically handled? What does the document say regarding who pays?
Chair, board members, you're correct in that the document does identify some cost figures. It is our understanding and the MPCA's experience that fence line monitoring is funded by the facility in question, where the monitors happen to be. In situations where there is no facility, the state has taken some action to attempt to place monitors. For example, be recently placed, or soon to be placed rather, monitors at or near Winona. As there is no specific facility near the roadway, the state has stepped in that particular instance. But where there exists a specific facility, then that facility is expected to bear the costs of the monitoring.
Thank you. Very well. Ms. Haugen, welcome to the board. Please introduce yourself and let us know. What you'll be covering.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. I'm Teresa Haugen with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. The next section of the EQB draft model standards and criteria document covers water standards. The water standards section of the document is the work of multiple state agencies and staff, including Department of Health, DNR, and the MPCA. The following 4 slides present a high-level overview of the content in the water standards section. Further detail on water standards is currently available on pages 32 to 62 of the draft document. The first part of the water standards section deals with the amount of water use or the allocation and control of waters of the state. When we say waters of the state, we mean both groundwater and surface waters. The DNR administers water use or appropriation permits prior to commencement of any silica sand operation that wants to use more than 10,000 gallons of water per day or 1 million gallons per year for activities such as dewatering, washing, and transporting of sand. If there are concerns regarding water use at silica sand operations, the local unit of government should work with the DNR to provide comments during the water appropriation permit application period. Local units of government can also work with the MPCA, DNR, and Department of Health to help to establish a detailed monitoring network. Additionally, as part of the water appropriation permit application for silica sand activities, the following is included: domestic well inventory, wetland delineation, hydrogeologic investigation, aquifer tests, groundwater computer model, and proposed monitoring. If any problems do arise with silica sand operations and water use, such as domestic well interference or water use conflict, DNR can work with local units of government on mitigation plans. The next part of the water standards portion of the document focuses on groundwater quality and gives suggestions to aid in protecting it. If there are concerns regarding silica sand activities and groundwater contamination, it is recommended then that a thorough site characterization and monitoring occur. The site characterization should include a hydrogeological study to ensure that the geology, hydrology, and distribution and movement of groundwater in the aquifer are well understood, and that any special features or conditions, such as karst formations and sinkholes, are adequately addressed to protect groundwater. A site-specific groundwater monitoring network should also be put into place to evaluate water quality information up gradient and down gradient of the site. Careful tailoring of monitoring well networks is recommended to help ensure that the complex hydrogeology, such as that found in karsted areas or aquifers in southeastern Minnesota, are accounted for. To further protect groundwater quality, sample and analysis of groundwater should occur. It is recommended that sampling occur pre-construction to establish a baseline of natural background conditions. Natural background conditions being what is naturally occurring in the groundwater. Sampling should continue to occur throughout the life of the silica sand site and continue post-reclamation to ensure that no negative impacts to groundwater occur. In addition, silica sand project proposers should complete a well inventory, perform proper well sealing, and notify the local unit of government and Department of Health when sealing occurs. It is also recommended that at least on an annual basis, silica sand facilities submit sampling and analysis results to the local units of government for their review, and if any signs of contamination are found, then the silica sand facility should mitigate as requested by the local government. The next part of the water standards section, the document focuses on surface water quality and its protection. If there are concerns with silica sand operations contaminating surface water, then there are recommendations in place that include best management practices and monitoring. For instance, if there are dewatering, processed wastewaters, and/or stormwater discharges to surface waters, then monitoring of these discharges is recommended. In addition, sampling and analysis of receiving waters should occur as well. And receiving waters, so the waters that the discharges go to. Monitoring of both the discharges and the receiving water is recommended. Pre-construction monitoring of receiving surface waters to establish a baseline for natural background conditions is again recommended. Monitoring of receiving waters should continue throughout the life of the silica sand operation and follow reclamation to ensure that no negative impacts to surface waters occur. Additionally, proper wastewater basin construction and management should be required to prevent unintended discharges to waters of the state, and if chemical additives such as polyacrylamide flocculants are proposed for use, there are precautions included in this portion of the document. And on at least an annual basis, silica sand facilities should submit sampling and analysis results to the local unit of government and mitigate if signs of contamination are found. The last piece of the water standards section of the model standards and criteria document covers stormwater, chemical containment, and temporary storage of sand. If there's concern about stormwater chemicals and/or temporary stockpiles contaminating waters of the state and causing nuisance conditions on neighboring properties, then proper stormwater management, runoff rate, and volume control along with proper pond design should be required. Stormwater should be managed in a manner in which the stormwater is contained on site so that pre-construction and post-construction runoff rates and volume are not different for a 100-year, 24-hour storm event. Ponds or stormwater control basins should also be properly designed and managed so that unintended discharges to waters of the state do not occur. All chemicals used in silica sand operations should also be properly stored and managed, including secondary containment when necessary to prevent spills, leaks, and other discharges. In addition, precautions to prevent contamination of stormwater runoff with chemicals or other significant materials, such as waste sediment that contains flocculants, should be put in place. Silica sand stored on a temporary basis should be enclosed to protect waters of the state. If enclosure is not entirely possible, then storage piles should be located and managed in an area that will not negatively impact groundwater and surface waters. For example, temporary storage piles should not be placed in surface water or stormwater conveyances such as curbs, gutters, and ditches. This will conclude the overview of the water standards section. Again, the water standards material just described with much further detail can be found on pages 32 to 62 of the draft model standards and criteria document. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Haugen. Are there questions for Ms. Haugen on her presentation for board members? I wanted to clarify on your previous slide, you had a statement regarding precaution for if flocculants are used. Is that similar to the last slide where you're talking about storage and chemicals on site? I mean, are the precautions similar across any of those compounds that might be considered toxic or a risk to water quality degradation?
There are different precautions for flocculant use built into the document. If they're going to be used in wastewater treatment, there are some specific precautions built in there. And then if they're used in wastewater treatment, then it's likely that they will be found in waste sediment that's maybe dredged from the ponds. And if that waste sediment is stored on site, then it's recommended that stormwater runoff and whatnot does not discharge from that pile to groundwaters or surface waters of the state.
So some kind of containment practice or
Correct.
other methods of disposal of that material. Okay. Mr. Tomlinson?
Excuse me. There are a couple places where recommendations monitoring data be submitted to the LGU on a minimum on an annual basis. I'm curious why annual was chosen rather than quarterly or some other increment.
A minimum of an annual basis was chosen. That was in the legislation that was written this summer. However, if LGUs would like it more frequently, they can certainly request more frequently or more frequent submittal.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Haugen.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. My name is Dave Christensen. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and we'll speak today on transportation-related issues. There we go. Transportation, in the case of silica sand mining, revolves around the fact that you have a bulk operation with very high volumes of truck transportation in certain areas. In the Minnesota River Valley and central Minnesota, most of the mines are self-contained. That is, railroad operations, transloading, processing are all on site, and there's very little trucking involved. That minimizes the impacts, obviously, to local communities and the road system. In southeast Minnesota, there is a very significant difference in the characteristic. The mines are smaller, more dispersed across the landscape, and the destinations for the sand are usually the ports or processing facilities, mostly near the Minnesota River, near some rail locations, but because of the lack of rail facilities in southeast Minnesota, there usually is a significant truck haul involved. Most of these mines will generate anywhere from 50 to 250 trucks per day, as well as the empty backhauls. That is similar to what is happening in Wisconsin. The average Wisconsin mine generates 70 truckloads per day currently. We have well over 100 sites within Minnesota that generate that much truck traffic or more. Sand and gravel quarries, hot mix plants, concrete ready mix plants, shuttle elevators for grain haulage, sugar beet factories, ethanol plants. This is not uncommon. The one thing that sticks out in truck hauling of silica sand is that usually the mine is attached directly to a single destination, a processing plant or a transload facility. That means that whereas most of the truck generating sites in Minnesota have a dispersed traffic pattern. In other words, when you get within a mile or two away from the site, the trucks are dispersed to all four corners of the compass. In the case of sand hauling, it's an intensive use of a single route, and that's where we have the impacts magnified. So we're looking especially at impacts not on state highways and federal highways, but particularly on local roads because they're light duty nature and their light design characteristics. So counties, townships, and local cities have the majority of the impacts. And this is a financial impact as well as a quality of life impact because you have roads that might be designed for few heavy commercial trucks a day. This intensive truck use may destroy the road that has a 20-year life in the span of 1 to 3 years. And that means that the local government is going to be liable for that expense if other accommodations aren't made. So we're looking at one kind of a three-legged stool, looking at a traffic impact study along the entire route so that we have some definition of what is going to happen in terms of environmental impact as well as road use. A road use maintenance agreement, which I'll explain in more detail, and safety accommodations because, again, the conflict between these heavy commercial trucks and other users of the roadway. The route assessment that comes in here at the very start is that the local government units have to determine, along with the cooperation of the sand company, what the route is going to be and what the effects of the heavy truck traffic is going to be on that route. Now, MnDOT, in cooperation with the Minnesota County Engineers Association, the local road research board, and the State University Mankato Engineering Department, several years ago put together a wear calculator, which is currently housed on the MnDOT website, to help local government units determine how much wear there is and how to allocate it to the user. And this is a negotiated private contract in essence. It's not part of the tax structure or the road maintenance from normal use in the state for public roads. Heavy trucks, of course, like I say, they are loaded in an axle rating of up to 18,000 pounds per single axle. That's called an equivalent single axle load unit, or an easel. Most light-duty roads in the country are built for maybe a 50,000 easel life over 20 years. A single sand mine might put 15,000 easels a year onto that road, which means that a 20-year road is going to be completely used up as far as design contingency goes in the case of several years. What happens first, of course, is the pavement starts to break up, the shoulders drop away. Later on, bridges and culverts will see major effects from that. One of the things is that we have to look at all parts of the road when we're looking at this. And an important characteristic of this traffic impact study and any road use maintenance agreement is that every local government unit and every impacted partner along the entire route should be part of this exercise, which is counter to the normal pattern of the traffic impact study. Like I explained, the normal traffic impact study will be in a small circle around the generator. In this case, we have to look at the entire route, and we emphasize that in the document. Also, we need to include in the traffic impact study the safety impacts, both for residences and other users along the route. One of the things we identified in southeast Minnesota in particular is the effect on non-motorized vehicle users and recreational users on the route. For safety accommodations, the safety conflicts are very important. We've seen this in west central and southern Wisconsin already, where if you've identified Amish and Mennonite communities, for instance, that use horse and buggy and horse-drawn equipment and don't particularly like to use warning signs and the like, if there are no shoulders on the road, no safety accommodations, signage, or an educational program, you're going to have fatal accidents at a heightened rate, and that has to be protected against. Again, this is part of the permit process, allowing for the fact that the zoning in the area requires a conditional use permit, and that the local government unit agrees to cooperate with everybody along the route. We have no state law that requires that right now, but it is a matter of best practice that we point out in the document. And again, MnDOT stands ready to help technically and in giving advice in providing for the accommodations will make these roads safe and reduce the safety conflicts. It's very obvious that you can't have a commercial truck loaded to 40 tons come in contact with a horse and buggy, for instance, or a bicyclist. The results are always one-sided. There's one other consideration that we've touched on in the document several places, and we'll hear about it again in the discussion on setbacks. But we throw this in the transportation because MnDOT is one of the main protectors of our scenic byways. We have 21 scenic byways in the state, 1 bikeway, and of course many, many regional and area trails. The FHWA defines intrinsic values that should be protected along these areas, and that's why we have a federal designation for scenic byways. For instance, along Highway 61, the Mississippi River, the scenic byway along the Mississippi River is protected by MnDOT easement to the top of the bluffs, which we bought with federal money that was allocated to us about 15 years ago. Other local government units have other protections thrown in, but again, we're looking at everything from archaeological and historic resources to scenic beauty. The byways that we have in here, you can see on the map that this is just a designation of 21 scenic byways we have. You see it covers pretty much the map, but especially in southeast Minnesota, we have a lot of areas. If you look at the map for state forest, for instance, all of southeast Minnesota is listed as state forest or parkland, except for the private landowners in the area. Unlike any place except the boundary waters in northeast Minnesota. So we have very high interest in this area. So that ends my presentation on the transportation issues with high overview, but those are the recommendations that you'll find detailed and discussed at some length in the document.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. Any questions from board members? Were there any differences, Mr. Christensen, on geographic areas of the state, or is it based on a different, you described the different sort of approach to mining, whether the transloading facilities are integrated into the operation. Was there anything in the transportation section that was geographically unique?
Yes, again, the recreational use, southeast Minnesota, and the cultural communities there that are specific to that area place a special emphasis on safety. Also the fact that, as you mentioned, the type of mining and the formations that are being mined. Along the Minnesota River Valley, we have mine sites that are several thousand acres in scope. And they have one or more processing plants on site. They have transload facilities. They have railroads running through them. Most of these facilities in the metro area, Shakopee and down by St. Peter and Mankato, never see a single truck except for service vehicles ever enter the road system. Whereas everything in southeast Minnesota is, for the most part, going to be running over the roads to get from the mine to a processing facility. And some of those mine hauls are going to be as long as 40 or 50 miles.
One other question then, did the document explore any unique rail transportation issues that need to be addressed by local units of government as they consider, for example, if a proposer came in with a transload rail out facility, does the document address that?
Yes, we do. We have discussion of the legal use, the non-discriminatory use of public roads, and also of common carriers, basically the interstate commerce system. That involves trucks running across state borders as well as the waterways and railroads. They are under federal regulation, which preempts local control, and there are cases that are in dispute right now on that issue. But the basic concept is that the local government unit can control the use of the public road system and even common carriers with their police powers to the extent that they don't restrict commerce and trade. So they can, for instance, designate that the railroad use covered hopper cars, but they cannot prevent the use of the railroad to haul sand. Same thing with covering trucks. The air quality issues of where the truck is dumped and closing the facilities, the location of areas, but the actual use, because sand is a common commodity. It's the second most common compound on the face of the earth, and we've been moving it and mining it for several hundred years. It's the case that an established non-hazardous commodity must be kept open for commerce in the transportation system. And we discussed that at some length as to how the Surface Transportation Board and Interstate Commerce under the U.S. Constitution interacts with those local police powers.
Thank you.
Can
Mr.
you,
Zilli.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you describe what the best practice is, and we've talked about this, of imposing an impact fee on the total route when it exceeds the boundaries of a local responsible government, like going into adjacent counties?
Right. And this is a matter sheerly of cooperation between the local government units. Even in Wisconsin, where they have a law empowering the local government units to enforce or regulate anything above and beyond the established traffic patterns, they don't cooperate. There's no requirement of state law. And we have even less of a regulatory framework for that here. But that said, if you have light-duty roads, our calculator points out that, for instance, you could have a road cost of up to 22 cents per ton per mile on that light-duty road, accrued by the local government. Now, the Highway Trust Fund is distributed from state and federal sources, local government revenues, and including an aggregate tax removal fee, which some people have said should answer everything. That's 15 cents per ton. If you have, let's say, a 15-mile haul on local roads, that is literally 1 cent per ton mile, as opposed to the calculated cost of 22 cents per ton mile. So it's a very inadequate source of revenue in this intensive use situation. We discuss all that and point out where the failures are in the system, and that this cooperative negotiated approach under the conditional use permit framework and a road use maintenance agreement finally signed by both parties with the sand company is the preferred way to go. And this is a precedent's been set in Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and many places across the country.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lambert.
Mr. Chair, you mentioned the scenic byways and the importance of the roads for that kind of tourism. I don't see anything in the document that specifically addresses that. Was it just the purpose of your information that there are protections in place, or are there some considerations in this toolkit for the local units of government to use?
There are considerations in toolkit, and we're still working on some of the details of that, but basically it discusses in there that a local government unit, either along the route or at the mine site or processing site, should have the consideration of these intrinsic values in mind for protection. For instance, a small town that has trucks running through them may want to make sure that their historic buildings are protected from road vibration. If they have archaeological sites that they know are common in the area of a mining site, there should be a professional evaluation, and our the state archaeologist and our Office of Environmental Stewardship have already stated they would be available to help with that, so that they can look at those possible shortcomings of a site or a route and rule on whether or not there needs to be any accommodation for that.
Is that all in the recommendations for the, what do you call it, the designated haul route?
Yes.
So that's in, okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Heather Ahrens. I work for the Department of Natural Resources. I worked on the operations sections, which was a combination of standards and criteria that fit under what would be expected for a mine processing facility or transporting facility to operate. So the process that I used to develop some of these criteria, standards, recommendations, was to look at functioning best management practices that have been established either within the state or nationally that can be applied to silica sand mining. The operations section contains 6 parts: lighting, hours of operation, reclamation, financial assurance, blasting, and blasting plans, and inspections. I'd like to say that a number of agencies contributed to this section, including MnDOT, MPCA, and the Department of Health. You'll see a format through this section just to be clear on what parts do LGUs have to or are responsible in regulating with mining. And some topics have overlapping regulations, and I wanted to be clear within the document that this is specified. So for lighting, both federal rules apply that are associated with OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, as well as the Mining Safety Health Administration. The state has an Minnesota OSHA where employers are responsible in making sure that they have the proper lighting for their workers. But LGUs have opportunities to address lighting through either ordinance or permitting a particular project. This section gives information on both. There are model ordinances that have been developed by lighting engineers and as well as the Dark Sky Association, International Dark Sky Association, that are being implemented to reduce nighttime lighting. There are concerns with nighttime lighting, both for human health impacts as well as to wildlife. So the overall reduction of night sky lighting is becoming more of a ongoing research topic and becoming better understood. If a community wants to address lighting issues, it is recommended that they adopt lighting ordinances to establish lighting zones. And if a mine were to potentially be proposed within a lighting zone, they would have specific criteria in which they can say you cannot have this output. On the other hand, too, you can address lighting through site-specific permitting processes, which include, establishing how you want to do a photometric plan, types of lighting that you would like to see, address potential lighting, trespassing, and glare issues. And so that can another option for LGUs to use. Moving on to hours of operation. This is completely regulated and enforced by LGUs for mining and processing facilities. And this can be done through ordinance, but as well as permitting. 3 options are available. You can have restrictive, where you specify restrictive hours, for example, 7 to 7. Or non-restrictive, where they can operate 24/7 and 365 days a year. Or it can be a combination of both, where you can mine, say, all the time, or process all the time, but maybe activities like blasting or removal of overburden or creation of berms, which are near property lines, may be restricted. Transportation is sometimes restricted to certain hours of the day, or if there's inclement weather, if there's concerns. Also, there should be considerations of what the adjacent land use is, the location of the activity on the property. Results of transportation studies as well as noise studies will all contribute into what is the most appropriate hours of operation for a facility. Reclamation is also regulated and enforced by LGUs based on permitting of individual sites. It is important to note that we are undergoing rules development for reclamation, and the information that is presented here may change because through the rulemaking process, we'll have to follow procedures outlined by the Administrative Procedure Act, which will involve significant public input and input from the advisory committee. So things may change. But in the meantime, LGUs can use some of the information here to implement mine planning and reclamation. And it's very important that this is done not at the end of the project, but at the very beginning, because reclamation and mine planning will also influence your financial assurance decisions as well as decisions about inspections and how you want to inspect. So all 3 of those topics are integral and relate to one another. Reclamation processes have evolved. Traditional approaches to mineland that disturb land and the stability of existing landforms can result in the flattening of hills and valleys and create uniform slopes. And so there's been, like I said, an evolution of reclamation to being more geomorphic, and where streams are replaced in a more more quickly and inexpensive designs to stabilize landforms, and that streams mimic both the look and natural functionality of nature. To prove a point of the importance of important mine planning, if you look at a mine plan, where are the roads going to be? What part of the mine is going to be accessed first? How are you going to handle topsoil? Because the quicker you redistribute topsoil, the better it's going to function. Where are you going to place your stockpiles? All of these questions have benefits not only to stakeholders who are looking for smaller footprints potentially or well-designed mines, but also to the mining company who has an efficient, well-designed mine plan. So reclamation and mine planning is really a win-win-win in terms of permitting a project. And I just like to show successful reclamation. This used to be a active pit to the right, and this is native prairie on the left, and the stockpiles of rocks was designed for potential wildlife habitat. And so to look at successful reclamation plans and to model some of the processes that are occurring in other states. Financial assurance is a very important aspect in relationship to reclamation. That is also implemented and enforced by LGUs. It's a function of the mine plan and inspections, as I said. And what I found, and I've worked with PCA, who's a financial assurance coordinator, to look at some of the existing rules for landfills that are available to LGUs that they can potentially modify and use for silica sand operations. I was very happy to see this because there is specific contract language that LGUs can adopt, especially for smaller LGUs, that can be modified, thought processes that are outlined, mechanisms, for example, of financial assurance. And then I go through and highlight how to calculate or what to consider when calculating financial assurance. It's important to put a caveat on that there's no way that I could potentially outline everything because it's going to be a site-specific issue. So, just some of the broad categories like how much grading and regrading topsoil, what's the vegetation and reseeding plan, and what's the short-term stability for the site versus long-term maintenance for the site, all wrap into determining the proper financial assurance for a mine site. Blasting and blasting plans. Out of my experience in working with people on aggregate and quarrying, I found that this is probably the one issue that has the most confusion of who regulates blasting in Minnesota. And I'm going to move on to this map. It turns out that Minnesota is one of the few non-coal producing states. So the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation Enforcement does not apply in Minnesota. So the federal standards that are out there for blasting are not regulated within Minnesota. There are regulations associated with ferrous and non-ferrous mining. However, that doesn't necessarily apply to silica sand mining or aggregate quarrying. So the LGUs are responsible for setting up blasting standards for non-metallic mining. They can do this either through ordinance or permitting. The good news is that many of the companies who are blasting blast in multiple states. They have to be licensed by the state, and they follow the federal standards set out for blasting by either the state or federal standards. The standards that were developed federally are based on 100 years of research of blasting with larger scale industries. And so they've modeled how blasting can affect old structures versus newly formed structures, or newly created structures and homes. And so there's a lot of information about the effects of blasting out there. I give references to communities that have developed blasting ordinances. If you want to develop a process to blast, how information you want to gather from an applicant, as well as setting potential standards that are commonly used for blasting within the state and federally, as well as other considerations. The other issue that I think that covers it. And so the final slide or the final section is on inspections. This was also regulated and enforced by LGUs. Inspections are a very important part of making sure that the reclamation plan and the mine plan is being followed, as well as the financial assurance that you have and that financial assurance covered. So it's highly recommended that you do at least annual inspections of a mine. The document outlines considerations of how do you do a pre-inspection, what you need to do before an inspection, during an inspection, and after, and just sets out protocols. And these protocols were actually developed by the California Surface and, I have to look this up, the California Surface Mining Reclamation Act that was created in 1975, so SAMARA. And they were written for LGUs to be able to implement. And the big caveat here, or the big underlying statement with all of this, whether it's setting up an ordinance or setting up a blast, or if there's a specific project that LGUs need additional expertise on, they can potentially bill the proposer to be able to consult experts and to be able to further identify studies and needs. And so that doesn't have to bear on the LGUs. They can potentially create a fund where they contract inspections out so that inspections are done by maybe a more technically trained professional. But the guidelines that were developed by California are meant to not necessarily be followed by a geologist or a registered engineer, but by someone who has a reasonable degree of training in mining. And additional information can be found within the document, I think on pages 72 through 106, and that concludes my section on operations.
Thank you, Ms. Aaron.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lyler.
Just one question, Heather, what's the current requirements for reclamation of sand and gravel operations, aggregate operations?
That is also defined within the county. So the county oversees reclamation, and it depends from county to county or township to township, depending on how it's regulated.
There's no state?
There's no state. There are handbooks and guidebooks that the state does offer, and information that the state offers for reclamation of sand and gravel pits, but we don't oversee it or regulate it.
Mr. Saxon.
Heather, you mentioned rulemaking on reclamation. Can you elaborate on that? Is that specific to Silica Sand?
Yes, it is specific. It's part of 3 rulemaking efforts that were directed by the legislature in this past session. The other 2 include emissions for silica sand operations and then environmental review thresholds. All 3 rulemaking is being coordinated together jointly, and the Silica Sand Advisory Committee for rulemaking will address all 3 rulemaking efforts. Right now, the process is that we've set out people have applied for the rulemaking committee, and we're right now going through the process of selecting members for the advisory committee, and hopefully that will be announced soon.
And that would have an impact on?
Well, that would, yep, that would. So things might change as we go through that process.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes.
Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. I'm Melissa Dobrowski. I'm with the Department of Natural Resources, and my colleague.
Bob Patton with the Department of Agriculture.
Thank you.
And as you mentioned, today we're going to be providing a broad overview on the topics and concepts associated with the considerations for setbacks and buffers section of the document. This section is found on pages 107 through 165 of the document, and as with the other sections of the document, this one is the result of multi-agency coordination. Before we get further into this discussion, I'm going to take a moment to actually define the terms setbacks and buffers for you, since that's kind of the basis, obviously, of this section. For the purposes of this document, a setback is defined as a defined minimum distance from a land use or cultural or natural resource or feature. A buffer is a strip of land containing vegetation, fencing, berming, or other construction. Unlike the previous topics discussed, which may have focused more on air quality or water standards, the section on considerations for setbacks and buffers actually includes a wide range of topic categories that were identified in statute and are listed here. During the development of this document, 2 additional topics were identified that also may be potentially impacted from silica sand projects. These topics are floodplains and cultural resources. And I believe, Commissioner Langria, this goes to a question you posed earlier to Mr. Christensen on finding further information on these topics in the document. Both of these topics have been included, as I said, into this section of the document. It's important to note that these 11 subsection topics vary in several ways from potential impact concerns, local land use considerations, feature characteristics, and regulatory processes. Therefore, the recommendations, standards, criteria, and/or considerations vary widely as well, from survey recommendations, permitting recommendations, and ordinance developments. And for the purposes of this presentation, will not be covered in detail. However, we're going to take a moment to touch upon one of the things that does divide these topics up a little bit better, and that's on regulatory processes. Generally speaking, some of these topics the state has lead authority over. Others, the local governments primarily have the authority over. For state lead authority, and the topics in this section include the ordinary high water level for public waters, designated trout streams and Class 2A waters, calcareous bends, and wellhead protection areas. Local governments may participate in these processes or add to these processes by providing input through state agency permitting processes, adopting or amending local ordinances for additional protection for these resources, and they may add more restrictive conditions than the federal or state minimum standards. I'm going to take a moment to provide an example of one of these, and I think it's one that we're all pretty familiar with. The designated trout streams and Class 2A waters. The 2013 legislature passed a statute that prohibits silica sand mining within 1 mile from designated trout streams, tributaries, potential designated trout streams, and seeps and springs that discharge to groundwater trout streams in the Paleozoic Plateau, unless and until a hydrogeologic investigation is completed and the DNR commissioner is satisfied that the mining will have no negative impacts on the trout stream. LGUs can and should work with the DNR and provide input when any such mining within 1 mile of southeastern trout streams is proposed. That's an example of a permitting process that's already in place. This permitting process, or the scope of work and the hydrogeological evaluation report, can also be, though, used by local governments in areas outside the Paleozoic Plateau, and can be used in the Minnesota River Valley or other areas of the state as appropriate. The subsections of this document in which the local governments have primarily local control over, or local authority over, include residential land uses, streets, roads, and highways, bluffs, critical natural habitat acquisitions, natural resource easements, floodplains, and cultural resources. An example provided for this is when we're thinking of bluffs. Local governments can use bluff protection ordinances through amending existing ones or developing new ones to minimize impacts to these areas by establishing setbacks from the top of the toe of the bluff, by requiring inventories of flora and fauna in the area, or prohibiting mining between the top and toe of the bluff. For the rest of the conversation, I'm going to turn it over here to my colleague, Mr. Patton, to talk about more of the broader concepts of setbacks and buffers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members. I'm Bob Patton again, and as Ms. Dobrowski mentioned, I'm going to be covering some general concepts, basically, on setbacks and buffers. This chapter was rather intentionally labeled considerations. Really, most of what's contained in the chapter, especially pertaining to some of the topics pertaining to local government, really are considerations rather than specific numbers or specific rules that would be adopted. One of the major points that's made in this document is that setbacks and buffers really shouldn't be relied on as a primary means for addressing impacts, protecting land uses from impacts of silica sand projects. Silica, of course, the intent of setbacks and buffers in the context of the silica sand issue is to protect neighboring land uses or natural or cultural features from impacts from silica sand projects. But there are other ways that are probably more effective, such as good land use planning and zoning, environmental review, and many of the measures that are covered in a fair amount of detail elsewhere in the document. So really, setbacks and buffers should be considered a supplemental means, not a primary means of addressing these impacts. And that's a point we make. I'm going to go I've had a lot of diagrams, and forgive me for the much Microsoft clip art used in these diagrams. The basic theory of both setbacks and buffers, particularly the setbacks though, is that the intensity of impacts diminishes as you get further away from the source of those impacts. You might remember from high school physics the inverse square law, where intensity of something such as light diminishes as an inverse of the square of the distance. So that's really what's illustrated here. As you move that full house further out, you have less intensity of impact. The thing is that in practice, this becomes much more complicated. For example, the intensity of impacts generated varies considerably from project to project. Also, and atmospheric factors can come into play, and this is, for example, wind. That's particularly true with air impacts, such as the movement of silica sand dust. Also affects noise. Also, landscape, the topography or terrain has a great deal of effect on these impacts. Hill between land uses can really do a lot to block noise, particularly light impacts, to some degree air impacts as well. So all these are factors, point being that many of these impacts are very site-specific and project-specific and are really most easily dealt with on that basis. However, local governments are still going to wish to, are likely to wish to develop setback and buffer requirements in their ordinances. Those should be ideally, and we recommend that local governments also have the ability to place additional site-specific setback and buffer requirements when they have discretionary permits, such as conditional use permits or interim use permits. So that's another major point of this document. One of the other consideration, on one hand, in terms of setting those ordinance setback and buffer requirements, has to do with the protection they offer. The other part is the impact on the ability of the property to be utilized for its allowable uses. And so there are some diagrams in the document that describe the various impacts of different setback distances on the remaining area available for the allowable use, and that's just for information purposes. These diagrams show the setbacks from property lines, and then there is also a diagram showing the impact of setback distances when they're measured from uses themselves, and this is sometimes done in local ordinances. Now, we recommend in the document that setbacks generally are established from property lines, and I'll explain why in just a moment. However, that's from land uses. From natural features, it makes sense to establish those setbacks from the natural feature itself, such as the stream. Regarding buffers, the buffers are generally either landscape or there's some solid feature, a fence, a wall, a berm. And for the vegetative buffers are very effective for softening visual impacts, essentially providing some greenery in between land uses. They're not so effective, not as effective for actually blocking light, and they're relatively ineffective for blocking sound. And so when you're looking at trying to actually block sound, and sound particularly, and light also, a solid type of buffer is what is really needed, such as a berm, as shown here. Touch on briefly on residential land uses and get back to this issue of property line setbacks. As I mentioned, property line setbacks are generally recommended, and the reason why is that they're really the most consistent in terms of their effect, and I'll illustrate that in the next couple slides. When there are setbacks, when setbacks are measured from the land use itself, for example, in this case from houses, here's a hypothetical case where there's setbacks drawn around the houses. A development comes in, say a Silica Sand development, and this is the developable area they have determined based on those setbacks. And as you can see, it is in conformance with those setbacks. However, the adjacent landowner to the east happens to wish to build a house closer to the property line. Maybe that's just the nicest part of the site for building a house, and that landowner is now closer to the mine than others. So in terms of kind of providing a level playing field, a property line setback works better. Now, we do mention in the document that having also setbacks measured from the land use, such as houses, in conjunction with that is useful where you may have existing properties where the houses are just a lot closer to the property line than is typical for the zoning district or the community. And so using that in conjunction, that provides an additional level of protection for those folks. We also recommend in the document that a greater setback is provided for residentially zoned land and for cities than for non-residentially zoned properties such as agricultural land. For streets, roads, and I'll mention that we do have in both the residential section and the streets and roads section, we have some data on information on existing setbacks that have been established locally from a survey we did of LGUs. For streets, roads, and highways, there are two main impacts that are discussed. One is impacts of the incursion of the activity, say mining, on the road infrastructure itself. And so that's what this little clip art diagram is supposed to be showing you. In this case, really, it's a very site-specific issue, and so there's the recommendation is that that there may be some standard setbacks, and there have been, as we know by local governments, that have been established from streets, roads, and highways. But there really also needs to be an ability to impose additional setbacks through the discretionary permits. Mr. Christensen mentioned the intrinsic properties of parkways, trails, and scenic byways, and this is just a couple slides showing some of these intrinsic properties. Basically, the intrinsic properties being those things, they're part of the statutes in terms of scenic byways, but they're the things that attract people to an area, either for quality of life or for economic tourism aspects. And so there are scenic byways in the areas, particularly in Southeast. In terms of setbacks, again, it's a site-specific or a community-specific type of matter in terms of how those setbacks are determined. And but So really, we just boiled it down to the setback issue there. That concludes my comments, and any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Penn. Any questions? Pretty good. Thank you very much. Board members, just before we, we'll take a brief break before we take comments. We have 9 people who signed up to be heard. I wanted to just get some initial reaction from board members on what you heard, or any thoughts that we might want to give the staff that are continuing to work on this document, refine it, and get it to a place where the board is, I think what the staff would appreciate is a little bit of conversation from our reactions and thoughts about further development. So, Commissioner Ellinger.
Mr. Chair, I was just wondering about, we talk about air quality and water quality. Also, I didn't see anything in here about the psychological impact. Is there any recommendations on sort of the monitoring of community mental health? Because certainly any projects like this we've seen in communities, if there is some monitoring of sort of the psychological impact. So I didn't see that in that, and I think we should probably have some comments on that. The other is, we rely on the monitoring technology, particularly for air. I'd like to know a little bit more about the reliability and the validity and the sustainability of that. How does it oversight of the monitoring techniques? I know that's been a question, and I didn't see, put it in. How accurate is it? How is it sustainable? How do we monitor the quality to make sure it's accurate in that? And then any recommendations or comments about the depth of mining related to groundwater, relative to that. I'd like to see some comments about that.
Thank you. Other thoughts, Commissioner Landwehr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. I think this is a lot of information. This is some really detailed work and provides a lot of good thinking about things to be considered. I served a couple terms on the city council, so I've had a little bit of exposure to ordinances and land use, but not a great deal of it, especially not from the standpoint of a planning and zoning administrator. I think, I would really love to hear what planning and zoning administrators think of this and how this works for them and what might be improved and what might be missing. And so, I think it's great for us to talk about this today, but I really would like to see what the people who have to implement think of this kind of stuff.
Commissioner Zilli.
Well, I was going to go along the lines of Commissioner Landauer. Great work on behalf of the staff. It is comprehensive, but one thought about how do you implement this is the challenge, I think particularly in transportation, is how do you enforce an agreement? I mean, it seems there's a lot of power in this agreement in terms of restrictions, routes, maybe even livability. There's a power in before both parties sign, it goes beyond a law. It's really an agreement. But once you have it, it's interesting if it's on site, then you kind of can drive over there and take a look. But when it's transportation, I think there's a challenge. I'm kind of interested in hearing from the, from the local governments, how would they view that?
Great, thanks. And just, Mr. Tomlinson, anything? Sure.
I guess just to echo the last 2 comments, it's a lot of great information. I like the format that it's in, a systematic format, and as far as usability for LGUs to use, because there's so much information, I guess as I was reading through this document originally, because of the format, I almost saw a process flow chart for decision making kind of thing, where a lot of the background information kind of thing, but yeah, so a lot of work went into this, and I just want to thank everybody who worked on it. Great job.
Mr. Saxon.
I would like to second that, the tremendous amount of work that went into this, and I just don't know where you found the time to do it. I assume you did, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Commissioner
Just a follow-up thought, if I could, John. I think One of the things that I'm cognizant of as well is that the implementers are local units of government, which can range from Hay Creek Township to Dakota County, or a much larger unit of government that has much differing capabilities of dealing with complicated issues. And if we didn't also acknowledge that we've got the technical advisory team established that can provide assistance on this, we'd be missing a part of the equation. That is, while there's a lot of information here, while it's fairly complicated and some of it's very technical, even a small unit of government would not be having to go alone and trying to interpret this. So we've got to remember, we've got some assistance out there too in thinking about how this might be implemented.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I was actually going to ask the Executive Director, Will Seufert, to comment on that, just sort of the role of these standards and criteria, the state rulemaking effort that's going on, and then the technical advisory work that's structured in the construct of law. Will, if you wouldn't mind to just comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll just take a couple minutes to provide some context and help kind of fill in the gaps of how this all comes together. First, some context for who we are. We were established, the subcommittee was established. The October meeting the charge within the resolution is that the subcommittee's charge is to advise the full Environmental Quality Board on fulfilling the duties assigned by the Minnesota legislature and on other issues related to silica sand activities, to provide direction to state agency staff working on these duties and issues on behalf of the EQB. We'll meet periodically to oversee a lot of different projects that are going on, and just to touch on a couple of them, as you probably recall, the 2013 legislature, they established a 1 mile setback, and a permit requirement at the DNR. It is my understanding right now that there has been no application for a setback permit to date. There have been 3 rulemaking assignments, an air emissions rule for the PCA, a reclamation rule for the DNR, and an environmental review related to silica sand for the Environmental Quality Board. We are in the process right now of trying to finalize a roster for an advisory committee to move those rules forward. And 14.101 goes into this process a little bit, but subdivision 2 just calls out each agency may also appoint committees to comment before publication of a notice of intent to adopt or a notice of hearing on the subject matter of a possible rulemaking under active consideration within the agency. That's the umbrella for how we're gonna use that committee to assist in the drafting of the rules. But this particular document is one of 3 legislative assignments that were all designed to provide assistance to local units of government. There was an ordinance library assignment that is currently on our website, but is growing and will continue to grow. Technical assistance teams, which Commissioner Landwehr mentioned, those were formalized in October and are available to help local units of government address various concerns that might be unique to their communities. And then this model standards and criteria document as well. And so those 3 are supposed to work together to help local units get the answers and the assistance that they need. But we're really hoping that in this comment period that we hear from local units of government, are these useful recommendations? Are they implementable? Are there things that are missing? And that will help, us come to a document that is most effective and useful for local units of government. So.
Great, thank you. Let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll begin the public comment period. I'm going to begin with Vince Reedy, who's on the list first. And so Vince just heads up. On deck after Vince will be Fred Corrigan, just for the sake of sort of the batting order that we'll take. With that, we stand on break for 10 minutes.